Today's presenter is from, he's worked all over the U.S. at DOTs as far as North Carolina, Washington. He's done specifically border crossings with Washington, state of Washington, Minnesota, and South Dakota, and he's a principal with Stantec. Please join me in welcoming Dale Grove.
Well, I usually like to move around with my presentations, but I'm kind of bounded today by the screens. So I'll stand at the podium, and as we go through the presentation today, there's enough information on this project, this bridge, that I could take us all up to happy hour and maybe just go out someplace and have a beer. So I'm going to move through quickly. So I'll encourage you, if you have questions, raise your hand when you come up with the question. We can talk about it, because there are so many things that went on in this project. Like I said, it could take a long time. But I'm here to talk about the Baudette Bridge. You see the existing bridge there on the screen. The bridge built in 1959 that we ended up replacing. We started project development in 2015, and this summer it's under construction. We'll be finished next year. Briefly, we're going to look at the location, the history, and need. Why was the bridge needing to be replaced? We'll talk about the team development, how we put our team together to address the needs of project development, some of the challenges that we faced developing the project, and then finally a few lessons learned out of doing a project like this. I've been project managing for 36 years, and I can tell you that this was the most challenging project I've ever had. I hope everybody gets a project like it sometime in your career, because you'll never forget it. Location, history, and need. Here's a quick map. You'll see there's Baudette and Rainy River up at the northern, near the northwest angle of Minnesota. And then a quick look as far as how the bridge is oriented between the two communities of Baudette and Rainy River. There we go. There's an aerial of the two communities. You can see Rainy River in Canada, Baudette, the U.S. border running roughly down the middle of the river. We learned plenty of things about how the border is determined as well, didn't we, Tom, early in the project? It's not a smooth line. It's a challenge to find it sometimes. Anyway, there's the city of Baudette. You can see Trunk Highway 72 and 11 come in, make a right angle, and head up toward the ports of entry on both sides of the border. As I mentioned, the bridge was built in 1959 for a total cost of $1.4 million, and I'll have a quick video here in a little bit that shows you some of the actual footage from construction of the bridge. It was put into place during the time where there's an initiative to connect Minnesota and Ontario. So it was constructed under that program, and it operated as a toll bridge. The city actually owned the bridge initially. It operated as a toll bridge until 1988, at which point the city had recaptured the money that it cost to build it. So at that point, they turned it back over to the DOT and the Ministry of Transportation Ontario, also known as the MTO. So if you hear me say MTO today, that's MnDOT's counterpart in Ontario. Here's some of that footage. Someone brought this to us at a public meeting and asked if we were interested in seeing video of the actual construction of the bridge. It goes much longer than that, but we were thrilled to get it, and it's really neat to sit and watch. If you ever want to watch 20, 30 minutes of construction activities in 1959 on a bridge, I could get it for you. And then finally, the bridge officially opened, and it was a big deal in those days to have an international border crossing, especially a new one at a location where traffic used to get back and forth between Rainy River and Baudette on barges. They would load up barges, pull you across, except in the wintertime, they would simply drive their vehicles across the ice. And we met one of the fellows who seemed to be traditionally the first guy to have his vehicle fall through the ice in the spring, which meant it was time to start using the barge again. But you can see they had 10 to 15,000 people show up at the grand opening. The RAF did a flyover, the Air Force did a flyover, dignitaries from all over. And we thought the most interesting thing about this whole ceremony was instead of a ribbon cutting, they took a piece of rope from the barge, put it across one end of the bridge, and then blew it apart with blasting caps because they wanted noise so folks on the radio could hear something happening. We don't think we'll be able to do the same thing, but we'd love to. What were some of the needs to replace the bridge? You can see from this next photo that active corrosion was reducing the structural capacity of the bridge. It's a fracture critical bridge, so MnDOT was focusing on replacing all the fracture critical bridges after the I-35 collapse. There's microbial-based corrosion. That's corrosion based off waterborne bacteria. And then finally, the emphasis on 152 in the initiative, they wanted to finally replace this bridge. There's one of the pictures from 2004. As you can see, that's still 14 years ago. You can see active corrosion and rust. We're losing some of the integrity of the main members and losing the capacity to carry any oversized or overload vehicles. So team development, what did we do when we were pursuing this team? It was somewhat challenging. You think about sometimes if you're involved in proposals, just putting a team together to help chase a project with MnDOT or with one of the counties or one of the cities can be challenging. On this one, we had 2 cities, we had 2 countries, and we had 2 transportation agencies that we needed to put together a team to address all the needs for, even though there was only one bridge. So we had a great concern at the start of the project that if we looked at simply assembling 2 teams with project managers, when we started looking at the bridge issues or the environmental issues or the electrical or the hydraulics or the lighting or the highway or everything else, that ultimately they were going to get to be at odds with each other, that there was going to be conflicts, that there were going to be decisions that had to be made. So who was going to take precedent and who was going to get control? So we changed it a little bit, and we built 2 teams, one for the U.S., one for the Canadian tasks, put them together under the leadership of a single project manager who was really responsible, that ended up being me, who was responsible for 2 things, and that was international coordination. What did we have to do to satisfy everybody on both sides, but also to satisfy the international needs of the bridge? About this point, we were talking to the MnDOT Bridge Office, and we told them, you realize that this is not a bridge project. It's an international border crossing project that has a bridge in it. I think they took umbrage to that. They like their bridges to be the reason for projects, but we found out that this really was not a bridge project. It was much, much more. Related to that, early in the process, I'll talk about this a little bit more. We brought everybody together from Canada, from the US, from MnDOT, from the MTO, for a scheduling workshop. The sole intent for the entire day was to look at some of the primary activities. You can see those along the bottom. And then as we were going through the NEPA process for the US, or the CEA process, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, what things were necessary and when did they have to happen, and what were the predecessors that needed to occur, and what were the timelines for advertising or public comment. And we had to start trying to match those up to build a single, cohesive, usable schedule for the project. That ended up being successful, and it was actually kind of fun until MnDOT made us do everything in P6. So if you've ever worked with P6, you'll know what I mean. So we got everything, we got a schedule. What were some of the challenges we faced? At startup, MTO had gotten to the position where they were anxious to get this project moving because they said we need to replace that bridge. MnDOT was kind of dragging their feet because MnDOT said it's historical, we've got to do some studies, we've got to look at mitigation, possible replacement. MTO had called MnDOT and said, you just do what you need to do, we're going to build our half and just hang it out there at the international borderline, and you can connect with it when you decide it's time for you guys to build your bridge. And they were serious about it. We talked them out of it, so we ended up with a joint project. But then it was who leads? Who leads the project? Who decides what gets done on this project? What decisions are made? How do we make those decisions? An international interagency agreement needed to be put together. So how do we handle design? How do we handle construction? With a new bridge, how are we going to handle maintenance? Because the old bridge was a steel grate deck, so new little things like snow plowing had to be looked at. Who's going to do what, and how's it going to be taken care of? And then finally, a consideration from MnDOT and MTO's perspective was, who do we assign to the team? Because this is going to be complicated enough that once somebody goes through that steep learning curve, we want them to stay with the project until the end of the project. We can't afford, under a compressed schedule, to be switching staff in and out and having them try to learn what's been going on. With that, then they said, okay, what do we assign a consultant to do? Early on, MnDOT had put their scope of work together for what they thought needed to be accomplished. They gave it to the MTO. MTO added 53 pages of scope to it. Nobody went through it afterwards. The result was we had a huge scope that had redundancies, it had conflicts, it had omissions. And we talked to contract staff and said, can we change it and rewrite it so we can get it down from 62 pages to maybe 20 pages, so much better scope. And I think everybody at the international issue was nervous enough about it. They said, no, just leave it as it is. We'll go with this. So we did. Going into the project, we knew there was going to be long distances involved. I hit a number of the cities that we visited. Our Canadian team was based out of Toronto. So we had regular interaction with them, which meant us flying up there, them flying down here. The MTO staff for the Northwest region of the MTO was based out of Thunder Bay. So when we had our technical advisory committees meetings, we switched every month between Thunder Bay and Bemidji. So the entire team would move to one or the other for those meetings. St. Catharines, we had a bridge workshop. I'll talk about in a little while there. Cleveland, we went to see the U.S. Coast Guard. They had issues technically. As an international project in international waters, this is a Coast Guard project, but they said, BINDOT, we'll allow you to do it for us, and then we'll have to approve it. But because it's international waters, it's owned and overseen by the Coast Guard. Chicago, because we had to meet with the GSA, Minneapolis, Duluth, Bemidji, Baudette, and the Rainy River. A lot of travel involved. Finally, one of the questions at startup was, who pays for what and how is that going to be paid? Yeah. You mentioned ownership a little bit. How do the two different countries decide who owns what? They owned up to the international border. So technically, that was how it was split in the agreement we found. When the city sold the bridge back to those agencies, they just said that'd be the easiest spot. So we own it to the border, which made it interesting, though, for maintenance and everything else, which was kind of nice because it allowed the two agencies to get together and say, how do we want to do maintenance in the future? Forget about this agreement that was, almost 50 years old, 60 years old. Some of the things we had to still face at the startup was the ports of entry. On the U.S. side, we have the CBP, the Customs and Border Protection Agency, in a building that's owned by the GSA, the General Services Administration, federally owned. On the Canadian side, they have the CBSA, the Canada Border Security Agency, who's charged with seeing people across the border and making sure things are safe. They both told us that we could not impact their operations and that the road could be closed up to 15 minutes. And then that was it. With the nearest crossing roughly 70 miles away, that was project constraints that we needed to really look at seriously and develop a project to meet those requirements. Split ownership of the bridge, as we mentioned. And one of the interesting things that we didn't think of right away is this is not a typical project. There's only 3 border crossings in Minnesota. This is probably the primary one. It's the only one with a significant bridge. Pigeon River is there, but that's not doesn't have cities on both sides. So that being said, there was no one that we could ask within Minnesota or really within Ontario that, what do you do on a project like this? There's no institutional knowledge. So we were kind of going into the whole thing blind. What were the reasons for 15 minutes? Why did they have to close it for 15 minutes? Well, they're both advertised 24/7 ports of entry with customs and everything else that goes on there. So they said, as a federal agency and relying on that kind of service to the public, yes, you can close it, but only for 15 minutes. So this stopping traffic. So, I mean, the port would remain open, but the queues would just build up on both sides, waiting if we shut it down for 15 minutes. But what was the reason for shutting it down? Oh, just for construction. Ultimately for construction. Yeah, no, that's fine. So some of the things that we found out that ultimately MnDOT decided they would be the lead on the project, that MTO would participate as an equal partner, 50-50 on everything. But there were some things that we weren't used to that were required with the U.S. MnDOT leading the project. A presidential permit is necessary. Any new structures crossing an international border require a presidential permit. We had to deal with the International Joint Commission, a commission that's set up of U.S. and Canadian staffs who regulate border crossings. Government-to-government agreements had to be put into place. State Department needed to be involved in all agreements because technically any agreement between any Canadian entity and U.S. entity is considered a treaty. So the State Department has to approve any and all treaties. And then finally, with federal funds involved in the project, there was a thing called Buy America, which meant that all the steel was supposed to be bought from the U.S. And you'll see we decided to make it a steel eye-girder bridge. And not long after that decision was made, the Canadian Consul General visited with Commissioner of Transportation and said, I don't think it's a good idea to have all the steel required to be coming from the U.S. when we're your equal partner, and we'd like the chance to supply that steel as well. So as we moved along, with the bridge being a big part of the project, we started looking at bridge standards. And one of the things that came up really early is you never use that type of construction. That's all we ever use on our side. And that happened during our field visit with the bridge staffs from both agencies. MnDOT mentioned that we love to do just poured-in-place decks. And Ontario said we hate poured-in-place decks. We never use those things. They like to do precast deck panels with an asphalt overlay and then everything else. But that was a big one, but there was more than that. We found technically that they had a lot of different standards. Ontario had one thing they like to use, MnDOT another. Down to construction methods, I mentioned precast decks versus cast-in-place decks. The rebar was different. MnDOT traditionally uses epoxy-coated rebar, and Ontario said we will never use epoxy-coated rebar again, ever. So, okay, there's another problem. But then it got down to just different experiences, different rules of thumb as far as how deep should footings be placed, what do we do as far as using black steel or stainless steel. Just the little proclivities that everybody gets as they move through and they get used to doing things that had to be compared and decided on which one are we going to do. Which construction method to use was a big deal. It was kind of a given thought at MnDOT that this was going to be design, bid, build. And Ontario told us very early on, we're not comfortable enough with design, bid, build, or design, build, to use it on this type of a project with this profile, high profile. So we ended up going design, bid, build. And then finally, just down to material differences, different things in different countries. There were more challenges than that. Here's another aerial of the bridge and the ports of entry. Canada's on the top, U.S. on the bottom. Some of the things we had to face as we started looking at project development and going through the NEPA and the SIA processes was the ports of entry. We couldn't impact operations. We could only shut them down for 15 minutes. The Rainy River, again, an international river, which brought in agencies that we weren't used to dealing with, but we had to work with closely on this project. Regional airport. Actually, Canadian emergency services fly people into this airport, pick them up and bring them back across the bridge. So we needed to be cognizant of that. And then also, because the primary runway you can kind of see is aligned almost, well, it is aligned perfectly to go over the top of the bridge, keeping those clear zones and glide paths clear of any future obstructions. The Canadian National Railroad Bridge is about 300 feet away. That was a historic structure. It's an old swing bridge that they had created and changed into a fixed bridge in the early 2000s. But that had to be addressed and dealt with. We had wetlands along the confluence of the Baudette and the Rainy River. Grave sites in the early 1900s. There had been a big fire in the area, and people had been put into a cemetery, which was relocated to this site at some point, and then it was relocated again. But when it was relocated from this site to someplace else, there were 3 families that they couldn't contact, so they left 3 graves here. Immediately adjacent to the bridge, that created a few issues. City Park, so you get into funding on city parks and the NEPA issues related to that. The Baudette River, which created a challenging and somewhat tricky hydraulic analysis, building the hydraulic models with the bridge right there. Stormwater management, I'll maybe touch on it a little bit later, but if you've ever dealt with Minnesota and stormwater management, you know that they're pretty particular about how their stormwater is handled. In Canada, they use scuppers and still drop their stormwater right into the river. They don't care. So tying those two together was a challenge. There's a power substation immediately adjacent to the roadway as well. And then finally, the city of Baudette has their treatment ponds right there. So within a relatively small footprint, if you think of the bridge being 1,382 feet long, to give you some perspective on how big of an area we're looking at, there's a whole lot of issues that needed to be dealt with. Environmentally, I mentioned there are historic bridge differences. The MTO determined that the bridge didn't qualify for the Ontario Heritage Bridge List. MnDOT thought it was historic. The differences between the two EA processes. Canada has an EA process that does not stop when you're done with your preliminary design. It continues all the way through their final design and needs to be finalized at the end when your plan set is done. So that created some issues. And then the ability of agencies, the ability of our team to influence agency decisions, because now we're not dealing with the DNR and the PCA and all the other agencies we deal with. Now we're dealing with two sets of them that don't necessarily agree on what they have to do for a single project and a single bridge. Non-traditional agencies, I'd mentioned those. Who do we talk to, and does anybody even have an idea who we have to talk to get our approvals? Here's a quick list of the U.S., Canadian, and international agencies we dealt with. Those are the primary ones. On the U.S. side, you'll see FAA, not that uncommon, but then you get down to the GSA and the U.S. Coast Guard. Those are ones we're not as familiar with, maybe. The Canadian ones, I didn't know anything about any of them until we started this project. At this point, I probably know too much about some of them. And then finally, the international ones. In this one, it's most interesting is the IBC, is the International Border Commission. Anything that you do within 10 feet of an international border is regulated by them. You have to get their approvals and you have to get their permits to do anything. We did try to make it fun, as much as it was just painful at times. We'd poke fun at our Canadian friends and they'd poke fun at us. They don't have consultants, they have service providers. We're dealing with a ministry and a department. We had lendings and tender closes. And actually, early on when we had meetings and were having conversations, I'd have to stop staff and say, explain what you're saying. Tell us exactly what that means. So we make sure that everybody from both sides understood it. Canada likes to use throwaway costs as a term that just means temporary construction. They really don't like throwaway costs at all. Roll up the rim. We learned really quickly that there's a, what's the name of the coffee shop that's making its way into the U.S. from Canada? Which one? Tim Horton. Yeah, they have contests where you have to roll up the coffee rim to see if you want a prize or not. They actually have a tool that will roll up the coffee rim to make it easier. But stuff like that. For getting passports and trying to get across the border was interesting. There's no such thing as a project in Canada. It's a project, and it's a process that we have to follow. So that acronyms, we had to keep it light because at times it was too frustrating to not. As we developed the project, getting this whole project started was kind of like deciding where to jump onto a spinning merry-go-round. It was pretty complicated. So we just jumped in with both feet and got things going and hoped we weren't dramatically wrong. To help us along the lines, for the project team, we developed a project communications guide. And that was directions to everybody on the Stantec team, whether you sat in Canada or the US or anywhere else working on the project, who was to be coordinated with, how they were to be coordinated, what you were to preface any email subject lines with, all the way down to the acceptable reimbursable expenses and everything else. It's about a 35-page document that we made every team member review and sign and return to us to be sure we didn't run into issues down the line because we just didn't have time for it. We had a technical advisory committee. We met monthly at least. Meetings usually ran 4 to 5, sometimes 6 hours to just start looking at issues and resolution of those issues. And we implemented something else that we created called a decision request and record. Just because I mentioned that scope was vague at best, it was a simple one-page document that anyone on our team could fill out saying, this is something outside scope schedule. I need approval for it. The U.S. and the MTO project manager were very good. We'd submit those. We had a number of them. Submitted to them. They'd review it within a day and sign it and get back to us. And it was simply a placeholder for a future amendment. It meant that something had changed, but we weren't going to stop work waiting for an amendment. They approved what was eventually going to happen. And after a while, it happened twice. We built up 3, 4, 5 of those. Then we'd process an amendment. But again, that was simply in the interests of not wasting time because we didn't have any time to waste. We put together a public and agency involvement plan, public advisory committee out of folks up in Baudette and Rainy River. Had a community platform where people could talk to us anytime. And then finally, One of the things we thought was important was within the NEPA process, within the SIA process in Canada, there's requirements for public meetings or public information centers, as they call them in Canada. We adjusted the schedule appropriately so all of those meetings happened at the same time on the same dates, because we didn't want anybody in Canada thinking that they were first and that was more important than the US side or vice versa. So we tried to be as cognizant as we could about providing information at the same time to both sides of the border. We did reach out to some other states and provinces. Maine, New Brunswick were primary, to see what had they done and what could we glean from their processes to help us out. We did a risk analysis that was continually updated throughout the project and talked about it every meeting. And then there was a value engineering process, which was kind of interesting because folks participating in the VE study got up there and I introduced the project and said, and by the way, we can't change the profile, we can't change the alignment, we can't change the bridge type. But now let's do a VE study. And they said, well, what are we going to talk about? Out of that whole week, we did get some good information that we supplemented and used in construction. There was the design standards. I mentioned that. Toward that end, about halfway through the project, we developed a pretty sizable document that had all of the design standards that we could possibly think of. The standard, the MnDOT standard, the MTO standard, what the project standard would be, and then a checkoff where people could sign off on whether they agreed with it or not. We'd set up a process to look at the variance resolution to get everybody to agree on what the project standards would be. That's extended all the way into construction requirements and testing. You think about the schedules of testing and everything else that they needed to do in construction. We had to decide on those things. And then who can do what on which side of the border. Canada's very sensitive about U.S. people coming across the border and doing the work that Canadian residents can do, especially since they were kind of in a depression economically. So they initially told the contractors that anything on the Canadian side of the border has to be done by Canadian residents or people from the First Nations. But that took up quite a bit of time for us as well. Here's just an example of that design standards resolution that we worked on. As I mentioned, we had 7 categories from construction to design to environmental to miscellaneous, but we listed everything out and we worked systematically through the whole process. Stormwater, I'd also mentioned there's different methods of managing stormwater on both sides of the border. One of the interesting questions we came up with early on is the high point of the bridge is not right at the border. So if rain falls in the U.S. and flows into Canada, who gets to regulate it? U.S. agencies or the Canadian agencies? That took a little bit of doing, but we ultimately got that handled as well. I mentioned the grave sites. What ultimately happened here was those grave sites stayed in place. We ended up doing GPR, ground penetrating radar, and a few other things to look to see if anything else could be identified. They weren't. But then with the MTO's position on the bridge is not historic and MnDOT's position that it was, we had to go through the NEPA mitigation process, but we only were allowed to offer half of a bridge for sale as opposed to normally the whole bridge, because Ontario sent us a letter specifically saying, we don't want to sell our half of the bridge. We want to just demolish it. I mentioned that we had to coordinate the processes with both agencies. One of the things we did along those lines is we had webinars. We had up to 36 different agencies that would attend our webinars where we gave updated project information. We highlighted decisions that had been made, and they were able to give us input one of 2 ways, either publicly through the chat system with the webinar, or they could give it to us privately, which a lot of them did because they didn't want to, after they heard that this agency had decided this, they didn't want to get into a match with them about it, so they would send us private comments and say, you need to talk to them because we don't agree with it. So that was part of that agency interaction and back and forth. We kept schedules, both detailed and then rough like this. These are the ones that we generally showed other agency staff and the public just to kind of keep them up to date with where we were and what was going on. You can see that we have the American flag for the NEPA process, the Canadian for their 2 processes, for their EA and for the SIA process. And then just our public involvement across the bottom. Ultimately, we identified a number of alignments with throwaway costs. We ended up picking the alignment immediately downstream of the existing bridge. So we're building within 6 feet of the existing bridge. So construction is tight, but that was the only way that we could not impact operations at the ports of entry and still allow the geometric requirements to get Our design vehicle was an RV pulling a boat with a car behind it. So that was an interesting deal. Wasn't that it, Tom? Okay. Yeah, that could create an international incident. We initially looked at 12 structure types, and we whittled it down to the continuous steel eye girder, haunched eye girders. The second place one was actually pre-stressed concrete beams, but we ended up not choosing it because to get the length we wanted, we needed a certain depth of beam, and those could be produced in the U.S. but not in Canada. So we couldn't preclude Canada from being the provider of those types of beams. There's roughly the alignment. You can see that it uses the existing bridge for traffic during construction, minimizes impacts to the U.S. and Canadian ports, allows for the geometrics that we required, and it did increase the length of construction, but to satisfy everything else, that was simply something we had to do. I mentioned it's continuous steel eye girder. That allowed us to also minimize piers in the water, which was important to both the environmental agencies on both sides of the border. MTO liked it because they had experience with that type of construction, so they didn't want to try something new at this location. The materials are available in both the U.S. and Canada, and it really is a cost-effective design. There's our permitting chart. We did this early as well, where we put critical project tasks, timelines across the bottom. And you'll see any permits or any boxes highlighted in blue are U.S. permits. The red ones are the Canadian permits. There are some purple ones in the middle and there on the bottom. Those are the international permits that were required. This was just critical to keep in front of everybody. What do we need to do with permitting, and what are the timelines we have to work with to make sure we get the approvals in time for construction? I mentioned the international permitting requirements. The IBC area, or the International Boundary Waters Treaty Act, has the IJC, which has a pretty stringent set of requirements. Canada has the IBTA, International Bridges and Tunnels Act, which put more requirements on top of us. And then the IBC, those are the folks that say anything within 10 feet of the border need our permission. So we couldn't even take, there's a plaque you saw at the start of the presentation that has the border line and it says Canada and US. We couldn't take that off. The contractor couldn't take that off. That was up to the IBC to go and take it off. And they said, we'll put it back as well.
IBC also has no mandated turnaround time. They can take as long as they want.
Yeah, some of the Canadian agencies are that way too. We were waiting for decisions. We said, well, when is this group going to get back together to make that decision? Oh, we don't know. But you'll get it eventually. Some of the issues we ran into with One River, different requirements. In-water timing restrictions. It's the same river at the same location, but U.S. and Canada had different in-water restrictions, which impacted construction and our scheduling for construction along with the costs. Different requirements for navigational lighting. It may not sound like a big deal, but Canada had the way they liked to do things, and U.S. had the way that they would do things. And ultimately what it came down to is Canada's was just a preference. The U.S.'s was legal. So the U.S. lighting took precedent on the bridge. Construction. Real quickly, issues and who administrates the contract on each side of the border. I mentioned the construction has started, so both MnDOT and the MTO have teams out there that are working on their side of the bridge handling their testing. A bigger issue is how do the contractors work across an international border? What work is permitted? What do they have to do? How do materials get across? If you send U.S. materials into Canada, are they taxed? Then what if they're in Canada and they come back to be put into the bridge on the U.S. side? What do you do? So that got to be a big issue. Having us put together a contractor information guide. It was about a 40-page guide that had, it had a disclaimer at the front that said, this is not everything you need to know, but it's a lot of what you need to know, with a lot of links to a lot of different agencies to give them the information that they needed.
Literally, if you've got a crew pouring the deck and you get to the border, you have to see crews.
Mm-hmm.
That might have been another specialty that they have to do personnel right there. The flaggers couldn't have the same flagger at both sides.
Nope. So we had 2 contractor information workshops. At the first one, somebody stood up at the end and said, so I have to have 2 of everything. I have to have 2 flaggers. I have to have 2 nut tighteners. I have to have 2 of everything. And the initial answer was yes. He said, what if I build my workforce making it as close as possible to 50% US and 50% Canadian? Can then they work anywhere? And the agency said, we'll have to think about it. So I don't know what the answer ever ended up being. But I know the contractors hoped it would be yes.
So let me answer the question. How are they doing it on that? You may get to this, and if you do, just tell me. On payment, because we got two different currencies you're dealing with two different values. Has that been established, or if you're on the Canadian side, you get Canadian funds? If you're on the American side, you get American funds?
Canada did us a favor, and they said, MnDOT, you can run the project. We will be a 50% partner, even though technically the bridge isn't 50-50, and if you look at the roadway construction costs, they're not 50-50. They just said for ease of everything, make it 50-50. So we had Canadian subs, we had US subs. Everybody would submit their invoices. It got rolled into US dollars at the exchange rate of the day. Got invoiced then to MnDOT, who eventually sent half the invoice to the MTO, which my understanding was then was also adjusted based on what the exchange rate was that day. So depending on what the exchange rate did, we could get a little more, we could get a little less. But thankfully, everybody said, let's just make it as easy as possible and 50-50 down the middle. So that is really it. That is the bridge project. I've got just a short video we put together to give everybody in the public and some of the agencies an idea of what it would look like when it's done. And this is a model that's put together. It's accurate to X, Y, and Z. So it's very indicative of what will be out there in a couple of years. And if you ever work with bridge engineers and you want to put large aluminum arches on your bridge to denote the location of the border, it's got pushback. Bridge engineers hated those arches. We'll have lit US and Canadian flags. We have lit collars for the flag posts that will upshine on the flags the whole time. It was interesting. The public up there said, we don't necessarily care so much what the bridge looks like because we were willing to give them pier shapes, colors. Railings did get to be an issue. They said, we just want a new bridge. This old one is kind of tough. It regularly was getting hit by oversized vehicles. So they liked the open concept. They wanted to be able to see through the railings down to the river. Initially, they also wanted bump outs at several locations to watch the fireworks on the 4th of July or just to go out there and be out on the river. The Border Security agencies shot that idea down. They said, we don't want people hanging out on the bridge. We want them on and off as fast as possible. So that's ending up what we put in to show where the border is and let people know if you're driving across with your kids, hey kids, we're in Canada now, yay, or vice versa. You don't need a passport to go on the bridge. If you go across to the Canadian port, you'll need to show your passport. No, but I'll tell you what, if you go up and hang around there for a while, you'll be surprised at how fast somebody from one agency or the other will find you, especially if you have a camera. They're pretty strict about if you're visiting the port, you will not take pictures that show any of the staff's faces. We don't want to see license plate numbers. They're pretty strict about what they would and would not allow. But that's it. Well, I got one more, I guess. Lessons learned. Be ready to listen on a project like this. We had 96 identified stakeholders that we needed to involve in the process and make sure they were happy by the end of it. We learned right away, and thankfully we got some of the agency folks to agree that my standards don't equal the right standards. We all had to do some give and take on the project to get to a successful completion. Normal standards aren't always acceptable. Just because MnDOT or MTO standard was more rigorous than their agency counterpart didn't mean that that's the right one, the one we had to use. We kept asking the question a lot, what is good enough? Does it have to be perfect, or isn't this good enough? Project-specific decisions had to be made, and we needed to document them, not just for our team, but for people elsewhere in MnDOT and the MTO and other agencies. We needed to have that. Tact choices with agency staff, we brought folks in. We had several meetings where, and I mentioned that bridge workshop where we went through a day of making decisions on what was going to happen with the bridges. That meeting and a few others, we mandated that decision makers have to be there. You can't send staff. that will tell us, I'm going to go back to the office and talk to people. It had to be decision makers because we couldn't waste the time letting you make a decision a month later. Be ready to travel. We did use the state plane quite a lot, which was nice. But I will tell you that using a charter is better because the state plane doesn't have a cooler with beer in it for the way home. A charter does. Then be ready to plan. We had a lot of TAC and PAC meetings, working to match up national processes on both sides. We ended up developing something called an actionable items list that at times was 10 pages long. That was everything that you were going to do or you were going to do. It was a to-do checklist that we updated and sent out every couple of weeks. And everybody agreed that they wanted MnDOT's feet held to the fire and MTO wanted their feet held to the fire. So we got to be the cops and tell them, you have to give us a decision by. And everybody saw it and they were very good about it. Schedules and deliverables, construction were just more of the issues that we faced. So at the end, the bridges are about connections, and thankfully our team was able to connect solutions to the challenge, and to think that going into it, some folks thought that changing the metric conversion was going to be the hard part of the project. That really ended up being no big deal. Yeah. And with that, if there's any other questions, that's the end of it. Yep.
And this is because I've spent time in the international borders. Who's going to own this thing when it's done?
Half MnDOT, half MTO.
Because, like, for example, I live right by the Blue Water Bridge, which is a major crossing.
Mm-hmm.
But it's kind of its own entity.
Yep.
You know, that's jointly owned by the province and the state. So it's neither Michigan DOT nor MTL.
Yep.
It's kind of like its own separate entity, but they're not going to do that on this one.
No, there was talk about would it qualify for a bridge authority, like for the Blue Water? No. They both own up to the border, but then that makes it interesting because if you start talking about maintenance, I talked to MnDOT staff, how do you see maintenance happening? They said, we would just like to do all of the maintenance and then just bill MTO every year, every other year.
Simple as payment markings and traffic signage. The Ontario standards are quite a bit different than our MUTCD.
Yeah.
So that's just going to be kind of quirky.
This was one of the areas where we got them started on it and gave them forums and ideas and everything else, and they said, we'll take it. And I said, yeah, good. But yeah, it's all the way down to that, and it's, really, if you look at the layouts, MnDOT's going to have to plow the bridge because there's space on the Canadian side for the plows to turn around and come back, but there's not the other way. So that's one spot where you can start, but it's going to be down to painting, it's down to inspections, it's down to everything. The conduits will carry everything across. The electricity runs halfway across and stops. So it's served by a Canadian electrical provider and a U.S. electrical provider. The telephone runs all the way across, doesn't it, Tom? But the electricity stops. So, yeah, I don't know that they've got it all hammered out yet, but they got about another year to finish it. Yeah. No, we didn't. We left a lot up to the contractor. I mean, we looked at that and thought if we start trying to go to that level of detail, we're going down the rabbit hole and it's just going to be a nightmare. So the contractors were all given the sort of the outlines of how they needed to operate. And if you could make my understanding is dollar-wise, they wanted it to be 50-50. I don't know if I should say it out loud. Actually, I mentioned Buy America on this project. We pulled federal funds off the project, so there was no Buy America requirement. It's Buy North America. It's a little way to get around something. But that was actually the recommendation of the Federal Highway Administration. So my understanding is they want it to be as close to 50-50 as possible. Yep.
Did you end up using one contractor or one each side?
We let them build their teams as long as they had the understanding that at least initially, half of their team was going to have to be Canadian. We said it would be inappropriate for us to determine, are you needing the team equally? Can you be a Canadian or a U.S. contractor with subs that take care of all of that stuff? So we just let them take care of it. And then actually a strong recommendation out of everybody was they're not, remember what they're called, Tom? Those folks that handle payroll taxes, who handle brokers. That every contractor is strongly urged to get a broker to handle just materials across the border and all the taxes and all the payroll and everything else.
The Canadians are much more complicated to deal with.
Right, and their wages were dramatically different. If you look at Davis Bacon in the U.S., I mean, we might be paying somebody $38 an hour to do something, and the Canadian wage might be $18 an hour. So they had a lot of things to figure out.
Here on the bridge construction, if you talk at all about further down the line for maintenance, when are you going to do this? And is there a group that says, okay, we're going to paint it all this year rather than just going to paint half of it this year? 5 years later, maybe the U.S. or Canadian might do the rest of it.
Yeah, we talked with maintenance forces out of MTO and MnDOT about what do they normally do and what has to be done for the bridge, and we assembled it into a package. And then that's what we gave it to them and said, we can keep facilitating these decisions if you want us to, but that's where they said we'll take it, because everybody agreed you didn't want MnDOT to paint their half of the bridge and then have the Canadians have these shade off or different. Who maintains the aluminum arches? They're on both sides of the border as well. So they needed to go through with their staff sitting together saying, what should it be? And again, I mean, MnDOT said it'd be easier if we just did it all. But MTO wasn't going to agree to that. So.
Tom, how did we do it?
We got latitude, longitude coordinates of PIs through the river that were supposedly tied out with concrete monumentation that we never.
Supposed to be station offset, right?
Yeah,
And we set up a crew that we didn't find everything.
we never found concrete monumentation.
Right.
But then the latitude, longitude was net 27, we converted to net 83, which is 50-foot difference. So if you look, you can see that line on Google Earth.
Yeah.
And it's the wrong one. So I'm trying to make sure we're doing this right somehow. And you compare, it's this far from the pier on Google Earth, and the lines coming through there. It's not the same line that we were using. But then, so we think we got it right, and then, 8 months later, like where exactly is this arch going to go? You know, right, where's your documentation?
Right.
I don't know. I remember thinking I had it right.
Yeah, in fact, it was interesting with the IJC when we talked about they wanted to remove the plaque and have some kind of monumentation on the bridge. We couldn't take it off. They came to get it off themselves, and we said, we'll put it back on. And they said, no, we'll put it back on. We said, do you want us to put into the bridge design some kind of a standard or something where you can just bolt it to? No, that's okay. We'll take care of it. So they were very, leave us alone. We'll take care of it. Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
How did you work out PE licensure between two countries, whether it's province versus state?
Yeah, there was an issue early. You can get a temporary Ontario PE license, but we ended up not needing them. We talked with like Tim Swanson's group, that take care of looking through the plans and everything else and all the requirements for it, and decided early on, were we going to have a single plan set that included everything? How do we stamp it? How do we take care of all of that? We ended up with 3 plan sets. So we have the U.S. roadway plan set, the bridge plan set, and the Canadian roadway plan set. And we signed the U.S. plans. Our Canadian staff with their Ontario PEs signed the Canadian roadway plans. And then who signed the bridge plans? Remember? Was it everybody? But working through the standards was tough because Ontario has different requirements on who and how things get done on plan signatures, stamping, than we do. So we had multiple meetings with Tim Swanson's office because MnDOT was administering the construction of the project. They needed to have materials listed so that it would fit into their program with the right numbering and everything else on all the materials used. So we needed to go to special numbering on all the Canadian specific items that were included. And so it seems like it should have been easier. wasn't. But that was a lot of things on this project.
They decided to do a plan, so it didn't have transport numbers, it had a Canadian bid item and another column saying, use this to correlate to that stuff.
Yeah,
Just a placeholder.
right. So then in the specials, we gave them, I don't remember what category numbers we gave them, but yeah. And the folks out of MnDOT didn't want too many new special numbers introduced because then they get into the system and people want to use them for other projects. And, yeah.
In Canada, the approach panel is part of the bridge.
Yep.
In the US, the approach panel is not part of the bridge. So our Canadian road designers didn't know how to include the approach panel. So the bridge consultant didn't know how to include the approach panel.
Yeah.
Where that going from? The bridge had certain kind of stainless steel rebar, right?
Yep. Stainless steel rebar in the deck and black steel in the piers.
Stainless steel, so we had
Yep.
glass fiber reinforced bars. So we had to develop a new standard plan. We did that approach panel.
We had to get agreement on lighting standards, different intensity standards. Well, we had 4 different levels of intensity standards: U.S. port, Canadian port, U.S. bridge, Canadian bridge. But we ended up getting agreement on a single type of lighting across. But then it was the posts and the mastheads. U.S. and Canadians don't match, and we didn't want 2 different kinds of architectural look on the bridge as far as that. So then, what's allowed to make maintenance easy for both sides? So yeah. Time capsules, that's right. I don't know who the idiot was that brought up you want time capsules, because we'd heard that there was one on the existing bridge, but we never found it, or no one ever. But the public insisted it was there, so we allowed the option to do time capsules on both sides of the bridge, and we just buried them in the wing walls, didn't we?
We ended up just giving it a standalone signal handle, basically.
Yeah. And we told each city, it's up to you. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. The Canadians gave in on that, so was cast in place. That just really briefly alluded to that workshop we held at St. Catharines. We developed a list of the most critical items, bridge related, all the way down to the least important items. And it was an interesting process because each side brought about 8 people. So the MnDOT Bridge Office had their top 3 folks there, plus other folks who were assigned to the project. And MTO had the same thing. We started out with bridge construction type, cast in place or precast deck panels. Now, after a long discussion, it ended up going cast in place. So MnDOT won that one. And then we talked about rebar. And MnDOT was okay with steel, stainless steel. They didn't necessarily feel it had to be epoxy coated rebar. But somehow it was perceived that MnDOT won that one as well. So then we went to break, and the Ontario staff called me over. He said, MnDOT's won 2. Unless we win the next one, this is going to get bad. So I talked to MnDOT staff and said, give me one that you can give in on. And we found one, and we did, and we made it through the day. But we just kept going as far as we could. We didn't get through the whole list, but let's get as far as we can and get it done in a day. So, and that was interesting. MnDOT flew out, but they had to fly into Buffalo because they took the state plane. Then they came across, and we all got together in St. Catharines. Interesting. Anything else? On the railroad? I don't know that they do. I know what they don't hear. I know that for sure. Yeah. No. Another interesting point, though, is both the port directors informed me that they regularly take firearms training and they go out and shoot every month. The pull weight on the triggers is much less for the U.S. staff than it is for Canadian staff, so just be aware if you're going to do anything up there. It might be a little tougher for the Canadians to shoot you than the U.S. folks.
All right, well, we'd like to thank you for presenting today. We've got a special NCIT portfolio based off of all the coordination and stuff you've been doing. We've got the pint glass. We probably should have do that. So.
Well, we'll be right. Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
Mike, right, thanks for coming.
That was fascinating. I don't know. I found it fascinating.
Yeah,
I'm not a bridge guy either.
Well, it ended up, like I said, I mean, Minda Bridge is where the whole project initiated. And it was, every time I'd go to see him, knowing that it was coming, it's the RFP should be out in a month. The RFP should be out in 2 months. And eventually I just said, you guys don't have a clue, do you, as to what
You want to do also recording it. So if we stop that.
Okay, I'll let you take care of it, Joe.
Perfect.
So, thanks. So eventually I said, hey, you guys don't know where to go. This project, So I still think that is God's part of saying, we should just annex part of Canada around the environment.
Yeah.
Then we'll get what we've done.